What would you risk to save a life for Clara Bellard? The answer came in blood and fire, long before she held a scalpel. The screams of dying horses echoed through the red dusk, while the smell of gunpowder and pine needles hung in the mountain air like an unspoken farewell. She hadn't meant for the journey to begin with blood. Clara Bellard had once believed that healing would take her into quiet places, sickbeds, clinics, maybe battlefield tents under canvas if things turned bad. But not here. Not in the high passes of the Arizona-New Mexico borderlands, where dusk arrived with fangs, and salvation could be as cruel as the bullet that missed its mark. The wagon fire crackled below her, its smoke curling like a funeral ribbon into the painted sky. Somewhere, far down the ravine, wolves began to howl a low, aching cry that pealed against the canyon walls. Clara pressed a hand to her belly, now round and taut beneath the torn linen of her traveling blouse. Her fingers came away sticky with blood, but not from the baby. That part, she thought with dazed gratitude, still seemed intact. The pain on her forehead had dulled to a hard throb where the outlaw's bullet had grazed her, leaving a thick welt near her hairline. Her vision swam, but her instinct still whispered, "Keep moving, protect the child." She crawled farther into the narrow crevice she'd found tucked beneath an overhang hidden behind a curtain of juniper, 50 feet up from the crash site. Earlier that day, she had been a doctor on a mission, traveling with precious medical supplies toward Dustwater Bluff to battle a cholera outbreak. Now, she was a ghost, with no horse, no allies, and a pulsing fear that death hadn't yet given up the chase. Down below, the fire danced higher. She had seen the bandits comb through the wreckage laughing, rifling through satchels, finishing off the wounded horses without a second glance. One of them, lean and rat-eyed, had joked about pretty doctors making poor coyotes meals. Their leader, the one with the black dog tattoo on his neck, had counted the gold coins and tossed aside a bloody journal as if it were trash. Royce Hanlon, she'd heard the driver mutter, known across the territory as Black Dog. Clara had recognized the name. Everyone did, in the last 2 years. He'd led the kind of raids that became whispered legend in saloons from Tombstone to Santa Fe. Cold-blooded, clever, and without conscience. And now, he'd taken her supplies and almost her life. But he hadn't taken everything. Her medical bag had been flung clear, and she'd found it halfway up the slope, hanging from a twisted pine branch like an offering. Inside, bandages, tinctures, a dull scalpel, and one silver stethoscope wrapped in oilskin, and in her coat pocket, a single hard biscuit and a canteen with half a swallow left. She leaned back against the stone, trying to slow her breathing. Every breath was sharp, like needles inside her chest, cracked ribs. Maybe. She wasn't sure. She didn't dare sleep. Not yet. The wind had shifted, and then footsteps. They were not hurried. They weren't the kind of boots that pounded or stomped. These moved with the weight of caution and knowledge, slow, deliberate, meant to be heard. Someone who wasn't hunting. Exactly. Or someone who wanted to be found. Clara froze. Below, through the curtain of branches, she saw a tall figure, not close, but clear in the moonlight. A wide-brimmed hat, coat flapping lightly in the breeze. A horse stood behind him, ears pricked forward. "Hello." The voice was deep, but it didn't bark. It rolled like low thunder over a distant mesa. Anyone alive down there? Clara said nothing. She pressed herself farther into the shadows, her hand tightening around the curved leather of her bag. I saw smoke from the ridge. The voice continued. Name Silas Wren. I'm a healer, not a bandit. If you're hurt, I can help. Healer. The word hit her like clean water. She didn't know if it was truth or bait, but she couldn't survive alone, not long. And her child deserved more than a nameless death in a wilderness crevice. She shifted forward, lips cracking with thirst. I'm here, she called, barely above a whisper. The man moved quickly, but not with a hunter's haste. He murmured something to his horse, then began to scale the slope with methodical care. Stone clattered beneath his boots, but he didn't slip when he emerged at the cave's mouth. She flinched backward, ready to strike. He stopped short. The firelight from below caught his face, leathery, tanned, eyes like river glass. His hat was dust-covered, his shirt frayed at the cuffs. But there was a steadiness in how he looked at her. Not pity, not surprise. Lord Almighty, he murmured. You're with child. 6 months, Clara managed. Are you really a healer? Yes, ma'am, he said, gently setting down his bag. My grandfather was a surgeon in the war between the states. I apprenticed under him before everything changed. Also spent some time with the Apache. Learned what they'd teach me. She didn't answer right away. He waited. My name's Clara Bellard, she said finally. Doctor. Philadelphia. Women's Medical College. Class of 1882. His eyebrows lifted, but he said nothing foolish. I was headed to Dustwater Bluff with supplies. Cholera outbreak. Stage was ambushed near dusk. Silas nodded slowly, then knelt beside her. May I? She gave a short nod, and he reached out with careful, competent fingers. He examined the wound on her head, the bruises on her ribs, the state of her breath. This needs cleaning, he said. Already tried, with whiskey. Hope you saved some, he muttered. But his hands were already moving, from his saddlebag. He drew out linen, a small vial of carbolic, a curved needle. Clara watched him work and felt something dangerous swell in her chest. Hope! Silas cleaned the wound, speaking only when needed. When he finished, he sat back on his heels. You can't stay here. This cave's been used by bears, and the cold will turn sharp soon. Plus, those men might come back. Clara's eyes drifted to the canyon below. I can't travel far. Not like this. My cabin's not far. 3 miles, hidden, warm. Got food, fire, medicine, and help. Help. My partner, Chaska Gray Elk, knows more about healing plants than anyone I ever met. Best tracker. 2. Clara hesitated. Why are you helping me? Because that's what healers do, Silas said quietly. And because the mountain told me someone needed help. He stood and extended a hand. I'll take it slow. Blanket saddle. We'll lash you safe. I'll walk beside. Clara looked at him for a long moment. In his eyes, she saw not the gleam of opportunism or the chill of judgment, only steadiness, and something else, wounds still unspoken. All right, she whispered. He helped her up, cradled her weight, like it mattered. The horse a calm, blue-eyed gelding stood perfectly still. The sky above was now dark velvet, the last of the smoke trailing like a spirit across the moon. What about the others? She asked, glancing at the canyon floor. I'll come back tomorrow, Silas said. Give them proper burials. They rode through silence and stone, the world narrowing to hoofbeats, pine shadows, and breath. The trail curled upward through pines and mist. Clara leaned into the warmth of the horse, of Silas's guiding hand. She did not speak again, but in her mind, a single word echoed. With each step, survive. I'm coming in slow, ma'am. Don't shoot. She doesn't have a gun, just a heartbeat under her ribs and the will to live. The cabin stood like a memory half forgotten, half hoped for wrapped in smoke and silence at the end of a deer trail. In the deepest part of the night, Clara Bellard arrived at the edge of somewhere between life and death. The canyon walls opened like folded arms, revealing a narrow pass where shadows pooled beneath towering pines. She had no strength left for questions. Each breath felt like it had been bought with the blood she'd left behind in Widow's Hollow. The horse's hooves softened against pine needles. Ahead, a plume of smoke curled into the sky, rising from a stone chimney. The cabin came into view not suddenly, but as if it had always been there, waiting. Its shape eased into the moonlight, solid and still, flanked by stacked wood and a modest barn. Warm light flickered in the window like a lantern set in the hollow of a heart, long hidden. She thought of her father then, the way his voice had sounded over the rattle of instruments in a Union field tent. The worst wounds are quiet. Clara. You'll miss them if you only look for blood. She remembered how he stitched with hands steadier than any she'd ever seen, but how his eyes had always trembled after the work was done. Now she watched as Silas Wren stepped to the cabin's porch and knocked once before pushing the door open. Inside, a man rose from the firelight, tall, lean, older than Silas by a few years, with a long braid streaked with gray. His face was carved by sun and wind, his clothes a careful weave of leather, wool, and cloth stitched with symbols Clara didn't yet understand. The man nodded once. She carries life, he said, not in a whisper, not loudly, but as if stating a truth that even the trees had already known. This is Chaska Gray Elk, Silas said. My friend. Clara wanted to speak, but found her mouth dry. Her body had begun to tremble with exhaustion, now that safety no longer seemed an illusion. Silas caught her as she slid from the saddle. Within moments, she was inside the cabin, laid upon a cot near the fire, her coat peeled away, a blanket draped over her. The scent of cedar smoke, bear fat, and crushed herbs filled the air, soothing and ancient. The walls were lined with wooden shelves crammed full of books, bandages, bottles sealed with wax, and bundles of dried plants hanging like prayers. You're safe here, Chaska said, setting a kettle to boil. Silas knelt beside her again, unwrapping the linen from her head. The bleeding had slowed, but the swelling remained. She endured the cleansing with a hiss, but didn't pull away. What is this place? She asked hoarsely. My grandfather started it. Silas replied. After the war. He said the cities had enough doctors, the mountains didn't. I kept building when he passed. And Chaska, he found me when I was almost lost, Silas said simply. Taught me to live again. You'll find most things here were made by his hands, or kept alive by his knowing. Chaska chuckled softly from the hearth. We all carry broken parts. Best to share the load. She slept that night without dreams, wrapped in warmth, her hand resting protectively over her belly. By dawn, a hush had fallen over the valley like a blessing. Pale sunlight spilled through the window panes, tracing the worn grain of the floorboards. Birds had begun to sing finches, mostly. The wind rattled the pine needles outside, but inside, the world felt still. Clara sat up slowly, noting the absence of pain in her ribs and the steadiness in her breath. On a nearby chair, a folded cotton shirt and woolen skirt awaited her. Clean, practical. She changed slowly, washed her face in the basin, and stepped barefoot onto the cool floor. In the corner, Chaska sat grinding something with a stone pestle, dark roots and leaves mixed into a thick paste. "You are strong," he said without looking up. "Stronger than many I have seen walk through this door." "I've seen worse," she answered, watching the mixture darken. "That's not what I meant." She glanced outside. Silas stood beside the barn, splitting firewood with smooth, practiced swings. His shoulders moved with the rhythm of someone who had long ago learned how to think without speaking. "Does he always do that?" she asked. "Only when he is unsure," Chaska replied. "The trees are quieter than people, easier to listen to." Clara helped prepare breakfast cornmeal porridge, venison jerky softened in broth, and a small tin cup of chicory coffee, the act of standing. Stirring. Measuring, these were the rituals she understood. The fire crackled behind her, a calming pulse. After they ate, Chaska brought out a small wooden chest filled with herbs wrapped in muslin and labeled in a script Clara recognized Latin names, written with care. She ran her fingers over the labels. "You're doing?" she asked Silas. He nodded. "And his. I handle anatomy. He handles spirit and soil. Together." They sat and compared notes, Clara listing cholera symptoms, Silas describing herbal purgatives. They spoke the same language, but with different words. It felt like meeting a long-lost sibling you didn't know you'd had. Later that afternoon, as the fire settled low, Silas brought out a canvas-wrapped bundle. Inside were surgical tools, scalpels, clamps, bone saw, suture kits. "My grandfather's," he said. "I've added a few of my own." She looked at the tools. "Clean and sharp. You've used them?" "Often." Clara traced the edge of a scalpel with her fingertip. "You ever lose someone you shouldn't have?" He nodded once, eyes distant. "A town called Willow Creek," he said quietly. Cholera hit hard. I was the only one left to fight it. 37 dead, including her. She didn't ask who her was. The grief in his voice was a river too deep to wade into all at once. Silas stood. "There's something I should show you." He led her outside, past the barn, to a hill behind the cabin. There, nestled in the earth, were 5 grave markers, each one carved from stone, etched with simple words, names, dates. A medal from the war rested on one. People who passed through, he said. Not all could be saved. She felt the wind rise. The air smelled of resin and old smoke. There was no sorrow in the place, just memory. "You've built a refuge here," she said. He looked at her. "It's not meant for hiding." "Then what?" "Restoring. For people who've been cast off, forgotten. People like you." She didn't answer. The truth was too close to her throat. That night. Clara stood in the doorway, while Chaska prepared herbs and Silas read by oil lamp. The baby shifted beneath her ribs, and she pressed her hand gently over the curve. For the first time since Widow's Hollow, she felt something unfamiliar calm. She stepped back into the warmth of the cabin, watching the 2 men, one scarred by war, the other by betrayal, quietly saving the world in their corner of the wilderness. And she wondered, not for the first time, whether the mountain had chosen her too. Your spirit was meant to break, but it didn't, Chaska says. Now comes the choosing. Spring comes in slow to the high country, one blade of grass at a time, bringing with it both thaw and memory. Clara Bellard stood by the window of the cabin, hands folded over her belly, watching the slow melt of snow along the ridgeline. It had been 2 weeks since Silas Wren carried her out of Widow's Hollow. 2 weeks since she'd looked death in the eye and told it. Simply, not yet. Now. The world was stirring again. Snowbanks shrank under the sun's soft press, Streams once locked in silence now gurgled over mossy stones. A breeze rolled down from the high pines, scattering needles and promises. The season was changing, but something else had begun to shift, too, inside her. She caught her reflection in the rippled glass. Not the same woman who'd boarded the stagecoach in Denver, medical bag in hand, letters of mission sewn into her coat lining. That woman had still believed in straight lines, in certainty, in duty, without fear. This version had seen what it meant to survive when the world stopped making sense. Her hand drifted to the small leather pouch resting on the shelf inside. Her wedding ring. She hadn't worn it since the canyon. She told herself it was for comfort, to prevent swelling. But the truth sat heavier. She didn't want to wear it anymore. The gold band had started to feel like a weight that pulled her into someone else's life. Behind her, Chaska Gray Elk moved silently through the room, sorting bundles of dried root and stacking them in rows along the counter. His movements were graceful, unhurried, like wind passing through tall grass. His presence brought a calm rhythm to the day, something Clara had begun to crave. "I'm not sure I remember how to live without a schedule," she said aloud. Chaska glanced up, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. Time is different here, measured by breath, not bells. He returned to his work, and Clara stepped outside. The air carried the smell of damp pine, firewood smoke, and thawed earth, down near the creek. Silas was gathering stones, his sleeves rolled, hands wet, building some kind of foundation beside a split-rail fence. He didn't look up when she approached, but she knew he'd heard her. "What's that for?" she asked. "Herb garden," he said. "Chaska's teaching me to raise roots right. Said it's time I learn what grows up from the soil, not just what comes out of it." She nodded, then paused. "I've been reading through your grandfather's notes." The man was meticulous. Silas gave a small grunt of agreement. He believed the West deserved good medicine, even if it didn't ask for it. There was affection in his tone, but also something unfinished. Clara didn't press. They worked side by side for a while, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of a hawk overhead. Just as the sun passed its peak, a sound cracked through the trees, fast hoofbeats, coming hard and uneven. Clara's body tensed. Silas straightened immediately, hand instinctively resting on the old rifle propped against the fence post. A rider broke through the tree line, slumped in the saddle, his coat torn and face dusted white with fatigue. His horse staggered to a halt near the barn, sides heaving, steam curling off its flanks. Silas caught him before he fell. "Name's Pete Brenner." The young man gasped, barely able to stay upright. "Red Tail Gulch. Caved-in mine. 3 men trapped. 2 more hurt. One's got his leg crushed." Clara was already moving, pulling her coat over her shoulders, her bag slung before Silas could speak. "You should sit," he said firmly, intercepting her. "I'm fine. You're not. And you're carrying—" "I've worked in worse shape." Silas. His eyes flashed, but she didn't flinch. Chaska had appeared behind them, quiet as always. "She's right," Chaska said, "but also wrong. Her time draws close." Pete tried to rise again. "Doc, please, he's just a kid. 17. If we don't do something—" Clara turned back to Silas. "We're both doctors, but I've done more trauma surgery than you have." Silas frowned, voice low. "I won't risk you, or that child." "You don't get to choose for me," she replied, steady. "If you leave without me, you're leaving someone behind who might make the difference between a life saved or lost." The fire between them sparked into silence. Then Chaska stepped between them, holding out a flat palm. "There is a way," he said. "Silas goes. I stay with her. If the child comes early, I will help. If the men at the mine worsen, Silas sends word." Neither answered right away. Finally, Clara nodded, agreed. Silas still looked uncertain, but he moved, gathering instruments, clean cloth, binding wraps. Pete steadied himself beside the horse. "I'll come back soon," Silas said, resting a hand lightly on Clara's arm. "And if anything changes anything, you stay here. Promise me." Clara held his gaze. "I promise." And then he was gone, vanishing into the trees like a shadow peeled away by the wind. The cabin felt quieter that evening, though the wind still sang through the rafters. Chaska brewed a tonic and handed her a cup. "You carry many things," he said, "but not all of them belong to you." She knew what he meant. The baby wasn't the weight pulling her down. It was the ring in the pouch, the letter from Thomas still unread, the part of her that wasn't sure where duty ended and identity began. "He's a good man," Chaska said, his eyes unreadable, "but he carries too much grief." "I'm not his wife," Clara said softly, "and that's not his child." Chaska tilted his head. "Are you certain of that?" Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. The night deepened. In the quiet, Clara laid her hand on her belly and whispered to the life growing inside her. She didn't speak of Thomas. She spoke of snow and firelight and a valley carved by survival. She spoke of a hawk's cry and a man who used silence like prayer. 3 days later, the sound of hooves once again broke the peace. This time, it was a young cowboy with windburnt cheeks and a telegram pinned to his saddlebag. "Message from Dr. Wren," he said, eyes wide at the sight of Clara's belly. "The miner's leg is infected. Needs surgery fast. Wants your guidance." Clara read the message twice, hands trembling. "I have to go," she said. Chaska looked up from the mortar and pestle. "You cannot," he replied calmly. "The baby could come any day. Then we hope she waits." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I will prepare the horses, but we go carefully, if you feel any sign of labor." We stop. No argument. They left at first light, traveling slow along the snow-slicked ridges. Clara rode side saddle, pausing often to rest, to feel for movement. Chaska walked beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. By the time they reached Redtail Gulch, the sky was darkening, and Clara's breath came shallow with fatigue. The camp was little more than tarps, plank buildings, and soot. Men paused in their work, astonished at the sight of her. "You're the doctor?" someone asked. "I am," Clara said. "Show me the patient." Inside a cold shack, lit by lanterns and desperation, a boy lay pale and feverish. His leg had swollen past recognition, the skin blackening at the edges. Silas stood at his side, eyes tired but grateful. "You shouldn't have come," he said. She set her bag down beside him. "Show me the wound," she replied. They worked for 4 hours, side by side, hands passing instruments and sutures without the need for words. Chaska tended the fire, boiled the water, kept the miners steady. When the final stitch was tied and the bleeding slowed, Clara leaned against the wall. Then, deep and low in her back, a wave of pain bloomed. She stiffened. Silas caught it in her eyes. "What is it?" She exhaled shakily. "The baby's coming." The snow fell sideways. As if trying to erase the trail, Clara and Chaska carved through the mountain's frozen heart. The storm was already rising before they left Redtail Gulch. But by the time they reached the far pass, It had become something else entirely, an avalanche of white noise and obliterated landmarks. Wind carved through the trees with the keening of 1,000 forgotten voices. And snow swallowed every hoofprint before the next step could follow. Clara Bellard gritted her teeth and held tight to the saddle pommel as Chaska led the mare forward, one gloved hand on her thigh to steady her when she faltered. Every few minutes, a sharp cramp twisted low in her belly. Too soon, too strong. She had counted the weeks, watched the signs, and convinced herself the baby would wait. But the child had its own plans. She leaned forward against the mare's neck and whispered, "Not here. Not yet." The mare whinnied in protest at the wind, but Chaska spoke to her softly in Apache, urging her forward. His long coat flared behind him like smoke. He carried a pack of birthing supplies lashed across his shoulder blankets, boiled linen, and the pouch of herbs he always kept near his heart. Up ahead, a narrow trail appeared through the pines, a path Clara didn't recognize. She tried to ask where they were going, but the wind snatched her voice away. Chaska turned toward her, his braids stiff with ice. "There's a line shack ahead." He called. "Cowboys use it for roundup. It's close. It will have to do." She nodded, unable to speak. Another contraction hit this one worse. She gripped the saddle, her vision blurring with pain. When the shack finally emerged from the white veil, it looked like something from a fever dream, 4 sagging walls, a chimney barely standing, a roof patched with bark and old tin. But it stood, and inside was dry ground. They got her off the horse, and inside with careful hands. Chaska clearing a space by the fire pit and stacking wood in silence. Clara sat back on a mound of folded blankets, sweat already rising on her skin despite the cold. Her breath came in short, clipped gasps. "The baby's in a hurry," she said, jaw clenched. Chaska lit a fire, the smoke curling up into the rafters. He moved with calm precision, boiling water, laying out the herbs, preparing a bed from saddle blankets. The wind battered the walls. But inside, the heat began to build. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, a new storm began to rise. She cried out once, then again. And Chaska came to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. His touch was steady, grounding. "You must breathe slower," he said. "You know this. You have told others. I'm not others," she snapped through clenched teeth, then laughed despite herself. "I'm too close, I can feel it." He nodded and brought her a steaming cup. "Sip this. It will ease the tightness. Not the pain, but the fear." She drank. The taste was earthy, bitter, and strangely comforting. The contractions came closer together now, relentless. Time folded in on itself, nothing but breath and ache and heat and the endless hammering of her heart. Silas arrived just after nightfall, the storm chasing him through the trees. He stumbled into the shack, soaked and breathless, eyes scanning for her before anything else. "Clara," he said, crossing the room in 3 strides. She gave a strained smile. "You're just in time." He dropped to his knees beside her. "What can I do?" "Boil more water. Tear those linens. Keep me from breaking your fingers." He smiled tightly, took her hand, and didn't let go. Labor surged forward. Clara shifted into her body, letting instinct and training guide her. Chaska murmured prayers under his breath while preparing bundles of clean cloth. Silas held her hand through every wave. The hours passed in a blur of effort and firelight. The storm outside never relented. But inside, the line shack. Something sacred unfolded, a ritual older than any town, any border. Sweat streaked Clara's brow. Her voice cracked from shouting. But she never begged, never surrendered. She had delivered children before dozens, but this one carved her from the inside. This one demanded everything. Chaska knelt beside her and listened with his eyes half closed. The child is near. Clara gave one last cry, and with it, her daughter was born slick and new, her cry rising over the fire's crackle like a bird taking flight. Silas caught the child, his hands trembling. His eyes filled with a kind of awe Clara had never seen before. "She's perfect," he whispered, holding the baby up to the firelight. "Absolutely perfect." Clara reached for her daughter, her hands shaking. The baby's eyes blinked open, startlingly blue, framed by a cap of dark hair. Tiny fingers curled around Clara's thumb with surprising strength. "She's strong," Clara said. "Stronger than me." Chaska tied the cord, wrapped the child in warm cloth, and placed her against her mother's chest. For a long time, none of them spoke. Then Chaska stood and placed a ring of cedar branches and herbs around the mother and child. "She is born between two worlds," he said. "Let her walk both with grace." "What will you call her?" Silas asked softly. Clara looked down at the child's face. Mercy. The storm had begun to die down, the wind losing its sharp edge, the snow softening against the walls. A fragile silence settled over the shack like breath held just before dawn. Silas sat beside her, rubbing the baby's back with careful fingers. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected, and he looked at her like he wanted to say something more. But then a sound split the night distant, but clear. Gunfire. One shot, then two, echoing off the canyon. Silas rose slowly, every line of his body going rigid. He moved to the door and opened it just enough to peer into the darkness. "They've found us." The blizzard buried the past and the present alike. But inside the trail shack, life refused to be silenced. Dawn arrived in shades of pearl and ash. The world still wrapped in silence, thick enough to muffle even the memories that haunted Clara Bellard's bones. She sat propped against a saddle blanket pillow, Mercy sleeping against her chest, the warmth of their bodies keeping both their hearts steady. The fire had long since burned to embers. Chaska stirred it now with a flat iron poker, coaxing it back to life as light filtered in through the cracks of the warped walls. Outside, the wind had quieted to a moan. The snow had buried everything hooves, blood, whatever it was that had screamed in the dark hours before dawn. No more gunshots came, but the danger wasn't gone. It had simply crouched back into the woods, waiting. Clara's thoughts wandered back to the first child she'd delivered. Years ago in Philadelphia. That girl had been 15, her body barely grown, her family terrified and ashamed. Clara had held her hand and whispered that the pain was a door and she was strong enough to walk through it. But she hadn't known. Not really. Not until now. She looked down at Mercy, her face round and impossibly small, already full of her own quiet gravity. There was no mistaking what had happened here. Clara hadn't just brought life into the world, she had crossed into something new herself. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was changed. Behind her, Silas Wren finished tightening the bindings on the cabin door, adding a plank to reinforce it from the inside. His shirt was still damp at the collar, and his eyes held the weight of a man who hadn't slept since yesterday. He moved like a shadow in his own life, watchful, gentle, but distant. Chaska handed Clara a clay cup with a steaming infusion. The scent of anise and chamomile drifted upward, grounding her. "This will help your strength return," he said. "Thank you," she whispered. "Careful not to wake Mercy." Silas came and knelt beside her. "There's no sign of them now," he said. "Tracks are snowed over. Could have been bounty hunters, or maybe just a lost rider firing at coyotes." She raised one brow. "You believe that?" "No," he said, "but I'd like to." They didn't speak for a long while. The baby stirred, but didn't cry, her tiny fists stretching toward Clara's heart. In the corner of the room, Chaska began packing their supplies with methodical precision. "We can't stay," he said simply. Clara nodded. She'd known it the moment the second shot echoed through the trees. Silas hesitated, then asked, "Can you ride?" Clara adjusted Mercy, cradling her closer. "If I can't, you'll have to drag me." That earned her the ghost of a smile. They waited until mid-morning before leaving, giving the storm time to soften and the baby one last full rest. Then, bundled in every scrap of warmth they could carry, they mounted the horses and began the long ride back to the valley. The world was transformed. Snow turned the mountain into a dreamscape, silent, brittle, and blinding in the sunlight. Trees bent under the weight of ice, and icicles clung like daggers to the underbrush. The trail was treacherous, invisible in places. But Chaska led them unerringly, like a hawk that had once flown these ridges blindfolded. Clara rode with Mercy, pressed against her chest in a fur sling Silas had stitched from saddle padding and a spare coat. Each hoofbeat jostled her ribs, and pain bloomed in her lower spine with every step. But she kept her face calm, breathing through her teeth. They made camp once in a hollow near a frozen stream. Chaska lit a fire under a rock overhang, and Silas carved snow into water, heating it slowly while Clara fed Mercy in the firelight. The baby latched easily, nursing like she already knew the world would not offer second chances. "How are you really?" Silas asked as he passed her a warm tin of beans and salt pork. "I'm exhausted. Sore. I keep thinking about how I brought another human into a world where the first sound she heard was wind and gunfire." He sat beside her, not touching, but close. She also heard singing, and you, and the sound of being wanted. Clara blinked hard. His voice had been low, steady, but something in it cracked open a door she hadn't dared to push on her own. They reached the cabin by dusk the next day. The valley seemed unchanged, yet Clara could feel its shift. The snow had deepened in the fields. Deer prints circled the barn. Smoke still curled from the chimney. But it was the smell, the faint tang of lye soap and cedar, that welcomed her home. Chaska opened the cabin door and lit a lamp. Clara stepped inside and exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. Everything was still in place. The books, the bundles of herbs, the old piano tucked into the corner like a long-forgotten hymn. Silas stoked the fire while Chaska moved through the rooms preparing bedding and broth. They laid Mercy in a cradle Silas had begun carving in secret, a simple pine box, smooth and low to the floor, lined with wool. Clara stared at it for a long time before saying anything. "You made this. Started it the day we found you," he said, shrugging. "Didn't know if I'd ever finish." "It's perfect," she said. Later that night, after the child was fed and wrapped, and the lamps turned low, Chaska took out a bundle wrapped in oilskin and handed it to Clara. She opened it slowly, finding a letter, already opened, and a small box tied with string. She knew what it was before reading the paper. Her name was on the envelope, in Thomas's familiar script. The box held her wedding ring, and a note written in a tone she knew too well, distant, formal, already halfway out the door. He had declared her legally dead. He was engaged to be married again to someone from a respected banking family. He had no interest in hearing from her if she'd survived. Her death, it seemed, had become convenient. Clara stood there for a long time, the letter trembling in her hands. Silas said nothing. Chaska looked at the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin but precise. He told everyone I died heroically, that it made for a better story. Silas rose. He doesn't deserve you, or your memory. No, she said, folding the letter. But he deserves to know I'm alive, and I'm not coming back. She moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered hills beyond the tree line. Mercy stirred in her cradle. Clara's shoulders straightened. You're free now, Chaska said gently. Freer than most. I want to be, she whispered. But I don't know where to begin. Silas crossed the room and stopped behind her. Start here. With us. She turned to face him. The silence between them had stretched for weeks, tied up in fears, half-formed wants, and guilt neither had earned. What do you want, Silas? He didn't hesitate. I want you to stay. Both of you. I know it's not proper, and I know it's fast, but I love you. Clara. And I love her. Like she's mine. She searched his face and found no uncertainty there. Just warmth and the quiet strength of a man who had carried sorrow long enough to recognize joy when it arrived. Before she could answer, Chaska stepped forward and laid a hand on both their shoulders. The child was born in storm and silence, he said. But now comes the peace, if you choose it. Clara looked down at Mercy, asleep in her handmade cradle. Her fist curled around the edge of a blanket embroidered with a single red thread. No regrets, no debts left to pay. Just this. A hawk's cry echoed from the ridge. They turned toward the sound, listening. Another echo cracked through the canyon at dawn. Silas didn't speak right away, only tightened the rifle strap and looked at Clara. We need to move, before the echoes become boots. The spring thaw came with blood in the river, but the child was safe. And that was enough for Clara Bellard to begin again. By late March, the valley had shed its silence. Snow turned to trickle, ice to rain, and life rose from the earth in careful patches. The pines stood greener now, heavy with promise, and the sun lingered longer on the cabin roof. From the porch, Clara watched small birds pick their way through the wet underbrush, tugging threads from the torn saddle blanket Chaska had laid out to dry. Mercy slept in her pinewood cradle, one small hand flung above her head as if reaching for something only she could see. It was quiet, but not the fearful kind. A wind moved through the trees with a soft whistle, somewhere by the creek. Chaska worked his herb garden, coaxing new life from the mud, and just beyond the barn. Silas Wren repaired the corral fence, sleeves rolled, humming something that might have once been a hymn. Clara sat with a letter in her lap, creased, torn at the edges, opened weeks ago, but read many times since. The signature at the bottom was still familiar, Marshall Calloway, her legal husband. Her declared widowhood had served him well. She thought she might cry when she first read it, but there had been no tears, only a cold kind of freedom, the kind that left you clean, but aching. Now, in this place that had become more home than Denver ever was, she felt something new rising the question of what came next. Mercy stirred, yawning with a sound that seemed too big for her tiny body. Clara leaned forward and lifted her, resting the warm bundle against her chest. The child smelled of wood smoke and wildflowers. She had begun to coo in 2 languages, English from Clara. Apache from Chaska, and already knew the sound of Silas's footsteps on the porch. Inside the cabin. The old piano sat against the far wall, its keys dusty but recently tuned, a gift from one of the miners, in trade for saving a crushed hand. Clara had taken to playing it in the evenings, mostly lullabies or the few hymns she could recall. Today, she waited until Mercy drifted off again before rising and crossing to the table. A sheet of paper lay waiting there, blank but not for long. She dipped her pen into the inkpot and began to write, not to Marshall, but to the Montgomery Parish office in Denver. She explained her survival, the ambush, and her status. She enclosed a sworn statement that she relinquished all claim to the Calloway name. She wrote, finally, that Clara Bellard had died in Widow's Hollow, and something else had been born in her place. She signed it with her full name and a flourish, Clara Wren, M.D. Outside, footsteps approached. Silas entered with his hand still dirt-streaked, a bundle of fence wire under one arm. Letter, he asked, nodding toward the table. To the parish clerk, she said, to be done with it. He sat across from her, waiting. She set the pen down. Do you still mean it? What you said the night we came back? He looked at her then, full and quiet. I've never meant anything more. I don't care if we're married by papers or pine needles. You and Mercy are my family. She called you Dada yesterday, Clara said softly. Might have been coincidence. Might not. Silas's expression broke open like dawn. I'd marry you today if you asked, he said. Then I'm asking, she said. The ceremony came that evening. Simple. Sacred. The clearing behind the cabin held the last of the snow in shadowed corners, but wildflowers had begun to bloom near the edges. Chaska drew symbols in the dirt, speaking words older than any law on paper. He burned sage and offered prayers in both his mother tongue and the English he had come to carry with equal weight. Clara wore a dress stitched from muslin and mended sleeves. Silas had found a piece of silver wire to fashion into a ring. There were no guests, no preacher, no music but the wind. But there was Mercy, cradled in Chaska's arms, and the mountain overhead like a cathedral roof. You are husband and wife, Chaska said at last, his voice low, firm. May your union bring healing to the world. Clara felt the words root themselves deep. This wasn't a marriage built to serve law or legacy. It was one made in storm and recovery, blood and grace. Later, they sat by the fire, Mercy between them, the air filled with the scent of venison stew and pine resin. Clara leaned against Silas's shoulder and felt, for the first time in years, the weight of her body soften with peace. I kept thinking I'd go back, she said, to Denver, to my practice. But that place, I was only useful there, not alive. You're needed more here, Silas replied. These miners, these ranchers, they're forgotten, like we were. She nodded. Then we stay, we build, and we teach her everything we know. The next morning, Chaska began expanding the cabin, marking off space for a new room that would serve as a proper clinic. He had already brought lumber down from the ridge. Within a week, Clara's books were unpacked on new shelves, and her surgical tools laid out beside Chaska's bundles of healing roots. Word traveled fast. First came a trapper with a shattered wrist, then a young couple with a newborn unable to nurse, then a rider from Dry Cedar Bluff with a message a child had fallen from a hayloft and needed mending. They didn't charge much, sometimes not at all. A sack of flour, a blanket, a fiddle song by the hearth. Their ledger grew thicker with names and needs, and each day, Clara felt herself become more fully woven into the life she hadn't known she was meant to live. Mercy was now 5 months old, healthy, curious, already walking her fingers across anything within reach. She could identify the jars on the lower shelf by scent: peppermint, sassafras, sweetgrass, and babbled endlessly when Chaska sang. One afternoon, while Clara organized her case files, Hope crawled toward the herb baskets and pulled out a bundle of dried lavender. "Mama, look," she gurgled, holding it up like a prize. Clara turned just as the bundle broke open, filling the air with scent and dust. Chaska chuckled from the doorway. "She's ready for apprenticeship." Outside, Silas worked with a local boy to repair the trail bridge. Behind the house, Clara had started a garden: potatoes, carrots, a few rows of onions, and at night, after Hope had been put to bed, the three of them would sit by the fire and tell stories not of cities or law firms or lost husbands, but of the land, of the people still out there, needing what they could offer. From the porch, Clara often watched the trail. "One day," she said, "someone from her old life might ride through. Maybe a newsman, maybe a patient who remembered her name, maybe even Thomas." But she knew now that whatever came down that trail, she would meet it as Clara ran. A healer, a mother, a woman who'd walked through fire and kept her hands open. That evening, a rider did appear, dusty, thin-faced, leading a mule stacked with supplies and an old revolver strapped loose at his hip. He paused at the edge of the clearing, eyes searching. Silas came from the barn, nodding a greeting. Clara joined him, their shoulders brushing as they stepped forward together. The man raised a hand. "Ma'am, sir, heard tell you've got a clinic here. My boy's bad-off fever won't break." "Bring him in," Clara said. They turned toward the house. Behind them, Hope giggled as she chased butterflies near the edge of the garden. Chaska hummed a prayer as he trimmed stalks of elderflower. The cabin stood tall, smoke curling from its chimney. They were not hiding anymore. A hawk soars overhead. Mercy laughs as she chases a butterfly near the herb garden. In the distance, a rider approaches. Clara shades her eyes. "Another one in need," Silas says, stepping forward. "Let's go greet them." There's a certain kind of stillness that comes after a storm, like the world holding its breath for just a moment before it continues on. And the valley where Clara Bellard, now Clara Wren, made her home, had a stillness about it that could be felt in the air, even in the footsteps of birds fluttering from tree to tree. The cabin stood proud, its wood now seasoned with years of work and care, smoke curling from the chimney like an old memory drifting through the trees. It was a place that held peace like a secret, where the sound of Mercy's laughter in the garden was worth more than any treasure buried deep beneath the soil, and where the wind that passed through the tall pines seemed to whisper of lives lived, of truths kept, of struggles buried, but not forgotten. In the late afternoon, the shadows grew long, stretching out over the land like fingers reaching back to the past, a past filled with broken promises, lost chances, and roads that led to dead ends, but still. This place was something more than a new beginning. It was the kind of place where regret could be spoken aloud, then left behind like an old coat on a hook, where the wind could carry away the shame that had once attached itself to a person's name. The old piano, still tucked in the corner, often played soft melodies when Clara found the time. And in those notes, the wind would find its way in, threading itself through the cabin like an old friend who never left. It would slip past the hearth, curling around Mercy's cradle, cradling the small child who had never known the cruelty of the world, only its healing. The small hands that reached out for the wildflowers in the garden were the hands of someone who had no idea of the pain that had once lived in her mother's chest. They were hands that reached for something as simple and pure as the earth itself, something that could be held close without fear of it slipping away. Clara often thought of the letter from Thomas, the husband she had once been forced to live for, who now remained a shadow, a forgotten name in a history too distant to touch. But as she read it, her fingers tracing the words in the quiet stillness, she realized something that had never occurred to her before Thomas's words, his legal declaration. They didn't change the truth of her life, no matter how many stories he told or how much the world believed them. She had lived the life she chose. She had made this home from the ashes of abandonment. And here, in the valley that was both their sanctuary and their witness, she found justice not in the ways the world might have seen it, but in the living, breathing people who stood beside her. And so, in the quiet moments when the wind didn't speak, but the world seemed to listen, Clara realized that sometimes the truth doesn't need to be believed by the world. It only needs one person to hold it close, to let it settle like dust in the warm glow of the firelight. That was the beauty of the life she had found. After all, the truth was never about being seen, but about being known to the ones who mattered, those who had walked the same path, shared the same air, and understood the weight of silence between words. Mercy, growing like the wildflowers outside their door, would carry this lesson with her in the years to come. She would learn that honor can be buried deep, but it can't be erased. That justice, though it may come late, still has its place in the world, and that the quiet strength of a woman, once forgotten, can rise up to heal what others had long abandoned, and as the stars began to fill the night sky. Clara felt something else, something she hadn't felt in years. It was a kind of peace, the kind that settles in when all the battles are fought, not with guns or blood, but with heart and truth. A peace that said it was enough. It had always been enough. To be who she was now, a woman who had found her place, her voice, her love, and her forgiveness. And as the wind sang through the pines, carrying with it the sound of children's laughter and the weight of old dreams finally laid to rest, Clara knew that the story wasn't over. It was only just beginning, for there was always more to learn, always more to share. If you still believe that justice matters, that love finds its way even through the darkest corners of the past, and that peace can still be made, leave a sign, leave a mark, just a simple number 1 for those who know what it means to fight with heart. And if you want to hear more of these old stories, to listen as we unravel the tales of the past, don't forget to subscribe to Western Story Chronicles, for there's always another story, another truth waiting to be told, and another heart, just like Clara's, ready to find its place in the world.